So let me get these T-posts off of here, pull back this tarp, and we'll see what we're working with. What's up, Lazy Dog fam? Hope all y'all are having a wonderful day. It is Thursday, March 27th here in South Georgia, and I'm about to pull back this tarp and hopefully reveal a beautiful weed-free canvas that's going to be perfect for planting squash. But before I do, I thought it would be really important to share with you 8 things that you need to know before you plant some squash. So don't plant squash until you consider these 8 things. Number 1, you want to make sure you choose the right variety or varieties to plant. This gets even more important later in the season, and even more important if you live in a hot and humid climate. Now, assuming you live in an area where you can plant several successions of squash throughout the warm growing season, that first planting doesn't really matter that much. But those later plantings, it really matters. And that's because your pest and disease pressure are going to escalate as things get warmer. So that first planting, that's where you can have a little fun. That's where you can maybe pick some of these novelty varieties of squash, some different shaped squash, things like that. Maybe some varieties that aren't quite as tough. They don't have a really good disease resistance. You want to plant those in that first window there before your pest pressure and your disease pressure gets really bad. And then with that second and definitely that third planting, you want to be sure to pick varieties that have some good disease resistance, that have some good vigor. That's where those hybrids can really help you out. Those tougher varieties that can withstand some of the rigors of a hot summer. So for example, with my first planting, I'll plant this Enterprise straight neck variety here, which has some disease resistance, but not as much as this Grand Prize variety that I would plant on my second or third planting of squash. And lastly, very important when choosing the variety or varieties of squash you're going to grow, plant something that you like to eat, because you're going to get a bunch of it. Plant something that you can get rid of, that you can give away. Don't plant something that nobody is going to want, because likely you're going to have more squash than you can eat, so you're going to have to give some of it away. Yeah, you can give it to the chickens, but it would be nice if you could share it with your friends as well. Now, me personally, I like growing straight neck squash just because I think they're easier to harvest, easier to cut up. But a lot of people around here still like growing those old-timey crook neck squash. Whatever you like, grow that, because like I said, you're going to get a bunch of it. The second thing you need to know before planting squash, you want to plant early, especially if you live in a hot and humid climate, going back to that escalating disease and pest pressure we talked about earlier. Now here I've been the last month, the whole month of March, waiting around for this mysterious last frost to appear, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen. It looks like our last frost this year is actually going to be in late February. So I could have planted several weeks ago if I wanted to, but now that I'm pretty confident we're done with freezing temps, I'm going to get mine in the ground as early as possible. And that's because in a climate like ours down here, it's really tough to grow squash in the dead middle of summer. It can be done. You have to fertilize the plants a lot, kind of push them through some of that pest and disease pressure, but it's still really hard to do. So we need to get our squash going early, eat all our squash we want to eat right now in the spring into early summer a little bit, because we know they're tough to grow in the middle of summer down here. Number 3, you got to give squash plants enough space. A healthy squash plant can easily occupy a 5-foot by 5-foot square. They get pretty dang big if your soil's nice and healthy and you're taking good care of them. So you need to plan for that when you're kind of laying out and planting your garden. And there's a couple ways to kind of account for how much space each squash plant is going to occupy. You'll see some people that just put maybe 4 squash plants in a 30-foot row. I like to do it the other way around. I'll plant mine relatively close within the row, but I'll make wider rows. So I kind of let them sprawl outwards as opposed to directly down the row. So I'll put my rows 5 or 6 foot apart, but then I'll have my squash plants maybe only 3 or 4 foot apart along the row. You can do it either way, but something to think about when you're planting your garden. Number 4, with squash plants, you got to have pollination. You got to have something that's going to transfer the pollen of that male flower to that female flower, enough of it to where you get some nice fruit development. If those female flowers don't get pollinated well, you end up with these funky shaped fruits that don't form out completely, or sometimes they can just rot on the plant before they get to a harvestable size. So some tips to encourage pollination: plant some flowers around your garden. If you don't have a good native bee population, try to encourage more pollinators coming into your garden. Out here in the country, we don't usually have any issue at all, but maybe in an urban area, you might not have as many pollinators there to work with. And of course, you can hand pollinate squash as well. That can be fairly labor intensive, but it can be done if you're willing to go to those lengths to get some squash. Now, there are some varieties that don't need pollination. We call those parthenocarpic varieties, and we've talked a lot about parthenocarpic cucumbers in the past. Probably more parthenocarpic cucumbers than there are squash, but there are a few varieties of squash that don't need pollination. This Golden Glory zucchini we carry is one of those, and I'm not sure how many others there are. There's a chart online. I know I've seen it several times. If you just Google parthenocarpic squash varieties, you'll see a list there, and you can pick which ones you want to grow if you're having issues with pollinators. Number 5, you got to watch out for that dreaded squash vine borer. That's probably the number one reason people fail at squash, is that particular pest can just decimate your plants in a matter of days. Now, if you go online looking for tips to help you out with squash vine borers, you'll find all kind of stuff, from things you can spray to actually kind of mechanical methods you can use on the plants, from wrapping the stems, injecting the stems with stuff. There's all kind of tips and tricks out there, and I can't really tell you which one of those work better than the others. So my best advice to deal with squash vine borers is to simply plant more than you need. Play the volume game, because say in a given 30-foot row, we may have 1 or 2, maybe even 3 squash plants get taken out by vine borers, but they usually don't take out the whole row. So what I'll do in a given 30-foot row, even knowing the fact that I probably only need about 4 squash plants in that row full grown, I'll plant seeds every 2 foot along that row, and I'll let all those plants get to a decent size before they get overcrowded, and then I'll start pulling them and thinning them out. That ensures I have some nice healthy plants. If a couple of them get crippled by the vine borer, not a big deal, because we've got more left there in that row. So play the volume game. I think that will help you out a lot. Number 6, as your squash plants are growing, you want to try and minimize leaf moisture as much as possible. If you don't have them on drip irrigation or on a soaker hose system and you're having to hand water them, try to water just at the base of the plants there. Try not to soak down those leaves with water, because that's just going to foster more disease issues, especially as things get warmer. And lastly, number 7, don't plant squash unless you're prepared to harvest often. I'm talking about maybe even every day sometimes. Usually at least every 2 to 3 days, but if you're getting a lot of rain, you may have to harvest every single day. If you don't harvest that often, you'll end up with a bunch of oversized, spongy squash that aren't fitting to eat. They're fit to give to the chickens or the worms. So if you're going to plant some squash, especially if you're going to plant, say, a whole row of it, you need to make sure you've got time to go out there every day, every other day, and pick those squash. And another little tidbit, I would recommend when you're picking them squash, do what we call picking them clean. So even if you've got some small ones out there, go ahead and pick those, because in a matter of just a day or so, they can become too big. So pick everything you see out there. Get the little ones, get the perfect size ones, take those oversized ones, feed them to your chickens. So if you consider those 7 things, I think you'll have a really great game plan that will help you have some abundant squash harvests this year. And one more additional bonus tip here: don't be scared to feed those squash plants. Fruiting vegetables like that like frequent feeding. So don't think you're just going to feed them all at one time and let them just ride on that fertilization. Give them lower concentrations more frequent feedings, and they like that a lot more. You want those squash leaves to be nice and dark green. You want some healthy plants. Those are going to produce a lot more fruits for you. So now that we've covered all that, I'm ready to jump off here and get my squash planted. But before I leave, I figured I'd show y'all what's underneath this tarp right here. So let me get these T-posts off of here, pull back this tarp, and we'll see what we're working with. Yeah, buddy, that's going to be nice right there. Ain't got to pull any weeds, ain't got to do any cultivating. We just put down our drip tape and plant. We're ready to go. Do have a few ant beds out there, and you'll get that if you leave a tarp on a plot long enough. Well, those will move just as soon as we start kicking around and working in here. And because we're still about a week or two away from planting watermelons, I just drug my tarp right over here, put it on this plot, and I'll just let it hang out there for another week or two. Instead of folding it up today, we'll just use it a little bit more before we put it up for a few months. Oh, and one more bonus tip before we go. I guess this is actually number 9, even though I said we were only going to do 7. For whatever reason, I have way more issues with squash vine borers in my raised beds than I do in the in-ground garden. And my raised beds aren't that old, only 3, maybe 4 years old. I can't really explain why that is, but just some info for you to digest there. If you have the option of planting squash in raised beds versus in the ground, you might have better luck in the ground than in the raised beds. I don't know why, but they always attack the squash in my raised beds way worse than they do the in-ground garden. So I hope you enjoyed the video today. Let me know in the comments below what varieties of squash you like to grow, and if you want to grow some of the same ones we're growing. As always, you can find some of those seeds on our website at lazydogfarm.com. And if you want to learn more about this whole tarping process here and the different methods we use to get our gardens ready for spring planting, watch this video right here. We'll tell you several different ways we prep our gardens for the spring and tell you the one thing you don't want to do. So check that out, and we'll see you next time right here at Lazy Dog Farm.